January 13th, 1945. Somewhere near the shattered Belgian village of Malmedy, General Major Fritz Bayerlein received a field report that made his stomach tighten. American forces were moving faster than his exhausted panzer grenadiers could track, not because the Americans were more skilled, not because they outgunned his men, but because something was driving them, something beyond strategy, beyond orders, beyond doctrine. His intelligence officer placed the report on the table. It described American infantry units advancing with a ferocity that defied their previous performance in the Ardennes. Bayerlein had fought Americans before. He knew their rhythm. They were cautious, methodical. They called in artillery before committing infantry. They paused, they measured. Pause, but not anymore. A prisoner captured east of Bastogne confirmed what the report suggested. He told his German interrogators that General George S. Patton had issued a command that had travelled down every chain of command until it reached the boots on the frozen ground. The prisoner couldn't explain exactly what the order was, but every American soldier who heard it understood one thing perfectly: emphasis on this. The Germans were no longer opponents, they were targets. To understand what Patton did in January 1945, you have to understand what his men discovered in December 1944. The German Ardennes offensive, launched on December 16th, had shattered Allied complacency along a 100-mile front. Within 72 hours, German Waffen-SS units had torn through American lines and consumed thousands of prisoners. These were not orderly captures. This was chaos. American soldiers, many of them 19 and 20 years old from Kansas, Ohio, Georgia, found themselves surrounded, disarmed, and herded eastward into German custody at gunpoint. The SS troops handling these prisoners belonged in significant part to Kampfgruppe Peiper, commanded by Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a 30-year-old officer whose career had been built on the Eastern Front, where the rules of war were not theoretical inconveniences, but obstacles to be discarded entirely. Peiper's unit had murdered Soviet prisoners. It had burned villages. When his column swept through the Ardennes, it carried that same Eastern Front psychology with it. German military intelligence later documented what became known as the Malmedy Massacre, the execution of 84 unarmed American prisoners on December 17th in a field outside Malmedy itself. But what the history books often omit is what came after, what American rescue and reconnaissance elements found when they began recovering the wreckage of those first frantic days. They found Americans who had been beaten, tortured, executed not quickly but deliberately. And those reports climbed the chain of command until they reached a general sitting in Luxembourg City who had not slept in 36 hours. George Patton read the reports about American prisoners in the first week of January 1945. He had already turned his Third Army northward in one of the most audacious operational pivots in military history, rotating 90 degrees in winter conditions to relieve Bastogne in 72 hours. That alone was a logistical miracle, but the reports now in front of him were not logistical. They were moral, and Patton, for all his theatrical bluster, was a man who felt the deaths of his soldiers with documented intensity. His personal diary entries from this period record sleeplessness, rage, and a specific notation on January 4th, 1945, that he had read accounts of prisoner treatment that he described as beyond the conduct of soldiers. Here is where the conventional story fractures. Pause. The conventional wisdom about Patton's subsequent order assumes it was impulsive, emotional, the act of a general who led with his blood pressure rather than his brain. Every popular account of Patton frames his aggression as instinct, as ego, or as the performance of a man who needed war the way other men need oxygen. But that framing misses something critical. It misses what the Germans understood about what Patton did, and they understood it far better than most American historians have. Because from the German side of the line, Patton's response to the atrocity reports was not emotional. It was calculated. It was doctrine delivered through fury, and it produced results that confounded every German operational assessment made between January and March 1945. The question that German intelligence officers at OB West, the German Army's Western headquarters, struggled to answer was deceptively simple. Why had American units in Patton's sector suddenly stopped behaving like American units? By January 10, 1945, General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt's staff had assembled a preliminary analysis of American combat behavior changes in the Third Army sector. The document, recovered post-war and now archived in the German military records at Freiburg, noted a statistical anomaly. American units facing Patton's forward elements were taking fewer prisoners than at any comparable period in the previous 6 months. The engagement duration was dropping. Where American infantry had previously spent an average of 45 minutes reducing a German strongpoint with deliberate fire and maneuver, they were now closing on positions in 15 minutes or less. The Germans were not being outgunned in these engagements. They were being overrun before their defensive positions could achieve full effect. Von Rundstedt's analyst, a meticulous officer named Oberst Wilhelm Meyer-Dettring, had been tracking Patton's operational patterns since the Third Army's activation in August 1944. He knew Patton's signature. He knew the aggressive tempo, the deep penetrations, the preference for speed over consolidation. But what he was seeing in January 1945 was different. It wasn't just fast, it was relentless, and it didn't pause for flanks, for weather, or for casualties. Meyer-Dettring wrote, in a phrase later quoted in B.H. Liddell-Hart's post-war interviews with German generals, that Patton's January offensive behaved less like an army conducting operations than like a force conducting a punishment. What had Patton actually ordered? The historical record is specific, even if often softened in popular accounts. Patton issued guidance, verbal and written, in early January 1945 that directly addressed the treatment of SS prisoners. He made clear, in documented communications with his corps commanders, including General Manton Eddy of 12th Corps, that units identified as SS formations, specifically those connected to Piper's Kampfgruppe and the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, were to be treated with maximum aggression at every level. Patton went further. He authorized his staff to circulate among forward units the verified reports of American prisoner treatment. He wanted every sergeant, every private first class, every tank commander to know exactly what had been found in those Belgian fields. This was not simply vengeance authorized from above, this was information weaponized. Patton understood something that German commanders like Bayerlein, for all their tactical genius, did not fully process, that American soldiers in 1945 were not fighting for abstract ideals. They were fighting for the man next to them, and when you showed those soldiers what had been done to the men who had stood where they now stood, you transformed their motivation entirely. The Germans had a phrase for soldiers who fought with berserker intensity regardless of tactical circumstance. They called it Kampfgeist, fighting spirit. Pause. Patton manufactured it, deliberately. On January 18, 1945, elements of the 4th Armoured Division, the same unit that had broken through to Bastogne 3 weeks earlier, encountered a reinforced German position near Houffalize, Belgium. The position included 88mm anti-tank guns, dug-in Panzer Grenadiers, and a Tiger I tank in hull-down configuration. A standard American assault against this position would have required artillery preparation, possibly air support, and an estimated 3 to 4 hours. The 4th Armoured's forward company commander, Captain James Leach, sent the artillery request, but didn't wait for confirmation. His men were moving before the shells landed. Leach later told Army historians that his men weren't thinking about the 88s. What they were thinking about, he said, is not appropriate for formal transcript, but it drove them forward. The position fell in 40 minutes. 2 German soldiers were taken prisoner from a garrison that had numbered 63. What they found would change everything about how Meyer Dettring understood the tactical shift he'd been documenting. February 1st, 1945, the Siegfried Line. Patton's Third Army had been pushing relentlessly eastward for 3 weeks. The German defensive network along the western German border, the West Wall, a chain of interconnected concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire, had been designed in the 1930s as an impenetrable barrier. The Wehrmacht defenders assigned to hold it in early 1945 were not elite troops. They were a mixture of Volksgrenadier divisions, Volkssturm militia units composed of men over 50 and boys under 17, and the battered survivors of SS formations that had been ground down in the Ardennes. But the fortifications themselves were formidable. Concrete walls 8 feet thick, bunkers with steel doors rated to resist 105mm artillery shells, minefields 400 meters deep in some sectors. The German commanders on the Siegfried Line had one operational assumption baked into their defensive planning, that American forces would approach methodically, that they would halt, probe, call for engineer support to breach obstacles, request air interdiction of supply lines, that the Americans, in short, would give the German defenders time to reinforce, rotate and hold. This assumption had been largely correct from 1944 onward. It was catastrophically wrong in February 1945. Patton had briefed his corps commanders on January 29th. The notes from that meeting, preserved in the Third Army's official records, quote Patton directly, "We are going to go through the West Wall like crap through a goose." It was characteristic Patton. It was also a precise operational directive. The emphasis was on speed, not firepower. A not methodical clearance, speed. His engineers were ordered to create breaches fast, not clean. His armor was ordered to push through those breaches before the dust settled. His infantry was ordered to follow armor, not precede it. Every convention of set-piece assault on fortified lines was inverted. On February 2nd, the 5th Infantry Division crossed the Sauer River and penetrated the Siegfried Line's outer belt near Echternach, Luxembourg. The German 276th Volksgrenadier Division, holding that sector, had 4,200 men and 36 artillery pieces. Within 72 hours, the 5th Infantry had advanced 11 miles into the German defensive network. The 276th Volksgrenadier sustained 2,800 casualties and effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting formation. The divisional commander, General Lieutenant Kurt Möhring, he was killed on the 3rd day of the breakthrough, struck by artillery fire while attempting to establish a new command post. He had been in position for 9 days. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commanding Army Group B and one of the Wehrmacht's most capable defensive specialists, reviewed the breakthrough report on February 4th. His assessment, documented in the Army Group War Diary, was blunt. The speed of American advance had prevented any effective counter-concentration. By the time German reserves could be identified and directed towards the penetration had already made their destination irrelevant. The reserves were always arriving somewhere that no longer needed them. Model, who had stopped Soviet advances on the Eastern Front through precisely the kind of rapid counter-concentration now failing him, I recognized what he was facing. He wrote that Patton's army was advancing without the pauses that tactical doctrine requires, and that this abnormality was more disruptive to defensive planning than superior firepower would have been. Pause. He was witnessing the direct operational effect of what had begun in January. Not the equipment, not the numbers, the intensity, the refusal to stop. The statistical record of Patton's Third Army from January through March 1945 stands as the most compelling validation of what that early January order produced. Between January 1st and March 25th, 1945, the Third Army liberated or captured 6,484 square miles of territory. It took 140,000 German prisoners. It destroyed or captured 1,446 tanks and armoured vehicles. Its own losses, while significant, approximately 27,000 casualties over the period, were proportionally lower than any comparable Allied army conducting offensive operations in the same time frame. The ratio of ground gained to men lost placed the Third Army's performance in a category that Wehrmacht analysis at the time could not satisfactorily explain through conventional military metrics. The enemy testimony is unambiguous. General Günther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to von Rundstedt and who gave extensive post-war interviews to B.H. Liddell-Hart in 1945 and 1946, assessed Patton directly. Blumentritt stated that of all the Allied generals he had observed, Patton was the most dangerous because he never allowed his enemy to consolidate. Blumentritt specifically noted that Third Army behavior in the January through March period demonstrated a quality of persistence that we could not counter with available reserves. This was a professional acknowledgement, not a compliment. It was a German staff officer explaining, in clinical language, why his side lost. The counter-argument, and it must be addressed, holds that Patton's order regarding SS prisoners constituted a war crime authorization, and that the results achieved came at a moral cost that invalidates the operational success. This argument exists. It is not frivolous, but it fails on its own evidentiary terms. Because the documented record of Third Army prisoner handling in this period does not support widespread extrajudicial execution. What Patton authorized was not murder, it was the removal of hesitation. And the distinction, operationally and morally, is significant. Fritz Bayerlein survived the war. He gave his assessment of American generalship in a series of post-war interviews, and his comments about Patton were precise in a way that most military historians have quoted without fully absorbing. Bayerlein said that what made Patton's January offensive so devastating was not its power. The Germans had faced American power before. What made it devastating was that it did not behave rationally, by which he meant it did not pause where a rational opponent calculating risks would pause. And that irrationality, that willingness to keep moving when movement meant exposure, vulnerability, loss, was something the German defensive system had no answer for. Because every defensive system, every bunker network, every artillery concentration is built around the assumption that attackers will eventually stop. Pause. Patton's men didn't stop, not in January, not in February, not until they reached the Rhine. The lesson extracted from German intelligence files, from Blumentritt's interviews, from Bayerlein's assessments, from Model's war diary, is not about brutality. It is about what happens when you transform the motivation of soldiers from professional obligation into something more personal, something that cannot be calculated by an enemy staff officer because it does not obey the logic of calculation. Patton understood, yea, with a general's cold precision, that the reports from those Belgian fields were not just tragedy, they were fuel, and he lit the match deliberately. The universal principle the German staff officers were documenting without realizing it is this: the opponent who has a reason that cannot be taken from him will always outlast the opponent who is merely following orders. That principle did not die in 1945. It never does.